April 1545. An indigenous herder named Diego Hualpa was searching for a lost llama on a mountain in what is now Bolivia when he grabbed a shrub to steady himself. The plant came loose, revealing reddish rocks beneath. That night, using the rocks to build a fire, Hualpa noticed something extraordinary: molten silver flowing from the heated stones. He had discovered Cerro Rico, the mountain of Potosi. Within a decade, a city of 200,000 people would emerge at 13,420 feet above sea level, making it one of the largest cities in the world, larger than London or Paris. The silver from this single mountain would account for 60% of all silver produced globally during the next century. Between 1545 and 1800, Potosi and other Spanish-American mines produced approximately 150,000 tons of silver, roughly 85% of global production. This wasn't just mining. This was the transformation of world economics, the funding of European wars, the creation of the first truly global currency, and the deaths of an estimated 8 million indigenous and African workers. The Spanish phrase "vale un Potosí," worth a Potosi, became synonymous with unimaginable wealth. Yet Spain, despite controlling this silver empire for 300 years, would end the period bankrupt. This is how one mountain changed everything. The Spanish Silver Empire that dominated global economics from the mid-16th to early 19th century represents one of history's most significant resource exploitation systems, generating wealth on a scale unprecedented before the Industrial Revolution. Understanding this empire requires examining not just the mining operations themselves, but the complete economic, social, and environmental system that extracted silver from the Americas and distributed it throughout the world. The discovery of massive silver deposits in Spanish America came at a critical moment in European history. Spain had recently completed the Reconquista, expelling Muslim rulers from Iberian Peninsula and consolidating Christian kingdoms. The Spanish monarchy was expanding its power and influence, but European silver supplies were limited. Most silver came from mines in Central Europe that were relatively modest in output. The arrival of Spanish conquistadors in the Americas would change this completely. The scale of American silver production was staggering. Potosi alone produced approximately 45,000 tons of silver between 1545 and 1800. Zacatecas in Mexico produced another 35,000 tons. Guanajuato, also in Mexico, eventually became even more productive. Dozens of smaller mining centers contributed additional output. The total represents several times the entire European silver stock that existed before American mines came into production. This silver transformed the Spanish Empire from a relatively poor European kingdom into the dominant global power of the 16th and early 17th centuries. Spanish silver funded massive military operations throughout Europe, financed construction of palaces and churches, supported the Spanish court's lavish lifestyle, and underwrote Spain's colonial administration across a vast empire spanning the Americas, Philippines, and territories in Europe itself. But the Silver Empire's impact extended far beyond Spain. The silver flowing from American mines created the first truly global currency. Spanish silver coins, particularly the silver real and later the silver dollar, became the standard medium of exchange throughout Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Chinese merchants accepted Spanish silver as payment for silk and porcelain. European traders used it for transactions across the continent, and colonists in the Americas relied on it for daily commerce. The human cost of silver production was catastrophic. The mining operations required massive labor forces working in extremely dangerous conditions at high altitudes. The Spanish colonial system employed various forms of forced labor, initially through the encomienda system and later through the mita, which required indigenous communities to provide workers for mines. Mortality rates were extremely high due to mining accidents, mercury poisoning, silicosis from breathing rock dust, and the simple physical exhaustion of brutal labor at high altitude. Environmental destruction accompanied human exploitation. The mining process required enormous quantities of timber for shoring up tunnels and for smelting ore. Forests around mining centers were completely deforested. Mercury used to process silver ore contaminated water supplies and ecosystems. The physical landscape was transformed as mountains were hollowed out and valleys filled with tailings from ore processing. The economic paradox at the heart of the Silver Empire was that this enormous wealth didn't create lasting prosperity for Spain. Instead, the silver influx contributed to inflation, discouraged domestic industry, and created dependency on imports. Spain ended the colonial period economically weaker than it began, despite 3 centuries of unprecedented silver production. This paradox, how the richest empire in history went bankrupt, reveals fundamental truths about the relationship between natural resources and economic development. The technological innovations developed for silver mining had lasting impacts beyond the mining industry itself. The amalgamation process using mercury to extract silver from ore was a significant metallurgical advance. The organizational systems for managing large-scale mining operations influenced industrial development, and the financial instruments created to move silver around the world contributed to the development of modern banking and international finance. The social transformations in the Americas were profound and permanent. Mining created urban centers in places that had been sparsely populated. Potosi became one of the world's largest cities almost overnight. The demand for food, clothing, and supplies for mining centers stimulated agricultural and manufacturing production throughout Spanish America, and the mixing of European, indigenous, and African populations in mining regions created the complex racial and social hierarchies that would characterize Latin American societies. The global economic integration driven by Spanish silver was unprecedented. For the first time, sustained trade connected Europe, the Americas, and Asia in a truly global economic system. The Manila Galleon trade, which exchanged American silver for Asian goods, created direct economic links across the Pacific. The Atlantic trade connected the Americas with Europe and Africa, and Spanish silver served as the lubricant, allowing this global system to function. Mountain discovery. The indigenous peoples of the Andes had known about silver deposits for centuries before Spanish conquest, but they had exploited them only modestly, primarily for ornamental purposes and religious objects. The Inca Empire collected silver tribute from various regions, and skilled metalworkers created sophisticated silver artifacts. But large-scale mining as Europeans understood it didn't exist in pre-conquest America. Diego Hualpa's discovery of Potosi in 1545 occurred during a period when Spanish conquistadors were actively searching for mineral wealth throughout their newly conquered territories. The conquest of the Inca Empire, completed by Francisco Pizarro in 1533, had yielded substantial gold and silver treasures from temples and palaces. But these were one-time spoils. The Spanish wanted renewable sources of precious metals that could generate continuous revenue. The mountain of Potosi, Cerro Rico in Spanish, meaning rich mountain, rose dramatically from the high Andean plateau. Its distinctive conical shape made it a landmark visible for miles. Indigenous traditions held that the mountain was sacred, and some legends suggested it contained great treasures, but that these treasures were forbidden. The Spanish would have no such compunctions about exploiting what they viewed as God-given resources placed in their newly conquered territories for their benefit. News of Hualpa's discovery spread rapidly among Spanish colonists in the region. The Spanish crown had established that all mineral deposits in the Americas belonged to the crown, with miners entitled to claim specific sites and operate them in exchange for paying a portion of production to royal authorities. This royal fifth, the quinto real, theoretically gave the crown 20% of all silver produced, though actual collection varied and was often evaded. The first Spanish miners arrived at Potosi in 1545 and 1546, establishing claims and beginning extraction. The initial mining was relatively simple because silver ore near the surface was extremely rich, sometimes containing 50% silver or more by weight. This high-grade ore could be smelted directly without complex processing. Miners excavated ore, carried it to the surface, and then smelted it in small furnaces called huayras that used wind for forced air. The huayra furnaces were adapted from indigenous Andean metallurgical technology. These were small clay furnaces with openings arranged to channel wind through the burning charcoal and ore. At Potosi's altitude and in the strong winds common on the mountain, these furnaces could reach temperatures sufficient to smelt high-grade silver ore. On windy nights, thousands of these small furnaces glowed across the mountainside, creating a spectacular display that travelers described with wonder. The rapid growth of Potosi was unprecedented. In 1545, the site was uninhabited. By 1550, several thousand people had gathered there. By 1560, the population exceeded 50,000, and by 1580, Potosi had become one of the world's largest cities with perhaps 150,000 to 200,000 inhabitants. This explosive growth occurred at an altitude where the thin air made physical exertion difficult and where the cold climate made survival challenging. The city that emerged at Potosi reflected the chaotic nature of its founding and the single-minded focus on extracting wealth. There was no central planning. Buildings were erected wherever space could be found. The wealthy built mansions near the central plaza. Workers lived in crowded, poorly constructed housing on the slopes. Merchants, craftsmen, prostitutes, priests, and officials all crowded together in a city whose sole reason for existence was the silver mountain looming above. The social structure of early Potosi was complex and stratified. At the top were the Spanish mine owners and major merchants, who controlled the most productive mines and the most lucrative businesses. Below them were skilled Spanish workers, overseers, and minor officials. Indigenous workers formed the lowest social class, though there were distinctions between different categories of workers and between indigenous people from different ethnic groups. The wealth generated in Potosi's early decades was extraordinary. The richest mine owners became fabulously wealthy. They built elaborate homes, purchased expensive imported goods, and lived in luxury that rivaled European nobility. The city had theaters, churches constructed with silver altars, and markets offering goods from throughout the Spanish Empire and beyond. Potosi became synonymous with wealth and excess. The Spanish crown's revenue from Potosi transformed royal finances. The silver flowing from this single mountain became the foundation of Spanish imperial power. It funded military campaigns in Europe, supported the massive Spanish bureaucracy, and allowed Spain to pursue ambitious foreign policies. The Spanish kings came to depend on American silver revenue, planning expenditures based on expected silver arrivals rather than on sustainable taxation of their European territories. But early Potosi also revealed problems that would plague silver mining throughout the colonial period. The high-grade surface ores were quickly exhausted. By the 1560s, miners were extracting deeper ores that were lower grade and more difficult to process. The simple smelting techniques that worked for rich surface ores couldn't efficiently extract silver from these more complex ores. Production began declining, and there were fears that Potosi might prove to be a brief bonanza rather than a sustainable source of wealth. The labor situation was also becoming problematic. The initial workforce consisted partly of indigenous people who came voluntarily, attracted by the possibility of earning wages in the booming mining economy. But as easily accessible ores were exhausted and mining became harder and more dangerous, voluntary labor proved insufficient. Mine owners demanded that colonial authorities provide additional workers, setting the stage for the forced labor systems that would define Potosi for the next 2 centuries. Mercury innovation. The declining silver production at Potosi in the 1560s created an urgent problem for the Spanish colonial economy. The solution came through the application of a metallurgical process that had been used in Europe but needed to be adapted for American conditions. This process, known as amalgamation or the patio process, used mercury to extract silver from ore and would revolutionize silver production throughout Spanish America. The basic chemistry of mercury amalgamation had been known for centuries. Mercury has the unusual property of forming amalgams with other metals, including silver. When mercury is mixed with finely ground silver ore, it bonds with the silver particles, forming a mercury-silver amalgam. This amalgam can then be separated from the waste rock. Heating the amalgam drives off the mercury as vapor, leaving behind pure silver. The mercury can theoretically be recovered and reused, though in practice much was lost. The application of this process to American silver ores was pioneered by Bartolomé de Medina, a merchant in Pachuca, Mexico, in the 1550s. Medina adapted European amalgamation techniques to work with Mexican ores, developing a process where ground ore was mixed with mercury, salt, and other reagents in large open-air patios where workers stirred the mixture with their feet and tools for weeks until the amalgamation was complete. News of Medina's success reached Peru, where colonial officials and mine owners were desperate for ways to revive Potosi's declining production. The Viceroy Francisco de Toledo, who governed Peru from 1569 to 1581, made implementing the amalgamation process at Potosi a top priority. But the process required one critical ingredient that Potosi lacked: mercury. The discovery of the Huancavelica mercury mine in Peru in 1563 solved this problem. Huancavelica, located several hundred miles northwest of Potosi, contained one of the world's richest mercury deposits. The mine produced cinnabar ore, mercury sulfide, which could be heated to release liquid mercury. The Spanish crown declared Huancavelica a royal mine and established a monopoly on mercury production and distribution. The connection between Huancavelica's mercury and Potosi's silver became the foundation of the colonial Peruvian economy. Mercury from Huancavelica was transported to Potosi, where it was sold to mine owners who used it to process silver ore. The silver produced at Potosi was then sent to Lima, where the royal treasury took its share, and the remainder was exported to Spain or used for trade throughout the empire. This triangular system linked the 2 most important mining centers in Peru. The implementation of amalgamation at Potosi in the 1570s required substantial investment in infrastructure. The process needed large amounts of water for grinding ore into fine powder. Potosi had limited water resources, so elaborate systems of reservoirs and canals were constructed to capture seasonal runoff and direct it to mills where ore was ground. These hydraulic systems were engineering achievements that required sophisticated understanding of water management. The grinding mills themselves were substantial installations. Water wheels powered heavy stone wheels that crushed ore into powder, fine enough for amalgamation. The largest mills had multiple grinding wheels operating simultaneously. The mills operated continuously during the water season, processing thousands of tons of ore. The ruins of these mills can still be seen around Potosi, testament to the scale of silver processing operations. The amalgamation process, as practiced at Potosi, involved several stages. First, ore extracted from the mines was sorted by quality. The richest ores might still be smelted directly. Medium-grade ores were sent to the amalgamation process. The ore was crushed in the mills into a fine powder. This powder was then mixed with mercury, salt, and other reagents in large stone-lined patios. The mixture was spread in the patios and turned regularly by workers and by mules or horses driven across it. The turning mixed the ingredients and exposed the silver particles to mercury. This stage could take weeks or even months depending on ore quality and environmental conditions. The cold temperatures at Potosi slowed the amalgamation process, making it less efficient than in warmer Mexican mining centers. Once amalgamation was complete, the mixture was washed to separate the mercury-silver amalgam from the waste rock. The amalgam was then collected and heated in retorts, closed vessels that allowed mercury vapor to be condensed and recovered rather than simply released into the atmosphere. The heating drove off the mercury, leaving silver that was then melted into bars for transport and sale. The mercury requirements for this process were substantial. Approximately 1 kilogram of mercury was needed to extract 1 kilogram of silver, and much of the mercury was lost during the process despite attempts at recovery. Potosi's silver production required thousands of tons of mercury over the centuries, most of which ultimately contaminated the environment as mercury vapor, mercury in tailings, or mercury in wastewater. The health effects of mercury exposure were severe and well documented even during the colonial period. Workers handling mercury experienced tremors, neurological damage, and premature death. The Spanish called mercury poisoning trembling disease because of the characteristic tremors it caused. Indigenous and African workers forced to work with mercury often developed debilitating symptoms within months. Many died from mercury poisoning, combined with other mining hazards. The economic impact of successful amalgamation was immediate and dramatic. Potosi's silver production soared from the 1570s onward. Annual production that had declined to perhaps 100 tons per year in the 1560s climbed to 200 tons in the 1580s and exceeded 250 tons by the 1590s. This represented roughly 60% of all silver produced in the world during this period. The technological solution had transformed Potosi from a declining mine into an apparently inexhaustible source of wealth. Forced systems, the massive expansion of silver production at Potosi and other Spanish-American mines required enormous labor forces working under brutal conditions. The Spanish colonial administration developed systematic forced labor mechanisms that compelled indigenous people to work in mines regardless of their willingness, creating one of history's most extensive and deadly forced labor systems. The initial labor arrangement in Spanish America was the encomienda system, established shortly after conquest. Under this system, Spanish conquistadors and colonists were granted rights to indigenous labor and tribute from specific communities. In theory, the encomenderos, grant holders, were responsible for protecting and Christianizing the indigenous people under their control. In practice, the system was often brutal exploitation, where indigenous people were forced to work for minimal or no compensation. The encomienda system proved inadequate for the specialized labor demands of large-scale mining. Mine owners needed workers with specific skills, and needed them continuously rather than seasonally. They also needed far more workers than could be supplied by the indigenous communities near mining centers. The solution was the MITA, a forced labor draft that required indigenous communities throughout a vast region to send workers to Potosi for rotating periods of service. The MITA was based loosely on an Inca labor system of the same name, though the Spanish version was far more extensive and exploitative. Under Spanish administration, indigenous communities within a defined jurisdiction were required to provide approximately 1/7 of their adult male population to work at Potosi for periods of 4 months at a time. In theory, workers would serve one 4-month term every 7 years. In practice, the system was far harsher. The geographic scope of Potosi's MITA was enormous. The catchment area extended hundreds of miles, encompassing much of what is now Bolivia and parts of Peru and Argentina. Communities at great distances were required to send workers to Potosi. The journey itself could take weeks or months, and workers had to provide for their own travel expenses and support during their time at the mines. The numbers involved were staggering. At its peak in the early 17th century, the Potosi meter required approximately 13,500 workers to be present at any given time. With rotations and journeys, this meant that perhaps 40,000 to 50,000 indigenous men were involved in the meter system annually, along with family members who often accompanied them. Over the colonial period, millions of indigenous people were subjected to meter service. The conditions at Potosi's mines were horrific. Workers descended into shafts that extended hundreds of feet below the surface. The mines were dark, poorly ventilated, and constantly dangerous from cave-ins, falls, and toxic gases. Workers carried ore to the surface on their backs, climbing rickety ladders while loaded with heavy sacks. A single trip from the deepest levels to the surface could take 6 to 8 hours. The altitude made all physical labor exponentially more difficult. At 13,420 feet above sea level, the thin air meant that workers became exhausted quickly and struggled to breathe. The exertion of climbing from the mine depths to the surface while carrying heavy loads left workers gasping for air. Many suffered permanent lung damage from the combination of altitude, dust, and toxic gases. The work in the amalgamation patios was equally dangerous, though in different ways. Workers stirred the mercury ore mixtures, bringing them into constant contact with mercury. The mercury absorbed through their skin, and the mercury vapor they inhaled caused neurological damage. Workers developed tremors, difficulty walking, and cognitive impairment. Many became unable to work within months of beginning their service. The mortality rate among MITA workers was extremely high, though exact figures are difficult to determine. Contemporary Spanish observers noted that workers often died during their service or shortly after returning home. Modern estimates suggest that perhaps 30% to 50% of MITA workers died either during their service or from illnesses contracted at the mines. Over the centuries, the death toll numbered in the millions. The economic impact on indigenous communities was devastating. Families lost adult men who were the primary agricultural workers and breadwinners. The communities had to continue paying tribute to Spanish authorities even while losing workers to the meter, and communities often had to pay others to substitute for workers who died or fled, creating debt burdens that crushed indigenous economies. The demographic collapse of indigenous populations in the meter region was severe. Communities subject to the meter saw population declines far exceeding the general indigenous population decline from disease and other factors. Some communities simply disappeared as survivors fled to regions outside the meter jurisdiction. The population of Bolivia declined from perhaps 800,000 at the time of conquest to fewer than 100,000 by the 18th century. The Spanish colonial authorities were aware of the meter's devastating effects. Numerous reports from priests, officials, and even some mine owners described the suffering and death. Some colonial officials recommended abolishing or reforming the system, but the economic incentives were too strong. The silver from Potosi was essential to the Spanish crown's finances, and maintaining production required the forced labor the meter provided. The resistance to the meter took various forms. Some indigenous people fled their communities to escape service, migrating to cities or to regions outside meter jurisdiction. Others paid for substitutes to serve in their place if they could afford it. Some communities filed legal petitions arguing they should be exempt from meter service. And occasionally, resistance took the form of violence, though such uprisings were brutally suppressed. The development of African slavery in the mines added another dimension to the forced labor system. Spanish colonial authorities imported enslaved Africans to supplement indigenous labor, particularly for skilled positions and for work in the amalgamation process. The enslaved Africans faced similar dangers as indigenous workers, but lacked even the theoretical protections that Spanish law nominally provided to indigenous people. The legal and religious justifications for the meter revealed the contradictions in Spanish colonial ideology. Spanish law and Catholic doctrine held that indigenous people were free subjects of the crown who should be treated justly. Yet the meter was clearly forced labor that violated these principles. Colonial authorities and theologians engaged in elaborate rationalizations, arguing that moderate forced labor was acceptable for the common good and that it helped civilize and Christianize indigenous people. Silver rivers, the movement of silver from the mines of Spanish America to Spain and throughout the world, required sophisticated logistics systems spanning thousands of miles across oceans and continents. Understanding these silver flows reveals how Spanish imperial power operated and how American silver transformed the global economy. The journey of Potosi silver began with its extraction from the mountain, processing through amalgamation, and casting into bars at the Royal Mint in Potosi. These bars were stamped with marks indicating their silver content and the tax that had been paid. The bars typically weighed 60 to 70 pounds each, making them difficult to steal but also difficult to transport. Coins were also minted at Potosi, though most silver left as bars to be coined elsewhere. The first leg of the journey from Potosi involved llama caravans carrying the silver to the Pacific coast. The route crossed the high Andes and then descended through desert regions to the port of Arica. The journey took weeks and involved risks from bandits, though the remoteness of the route and the weight of silver bars made large-scale theft difficult. The llamas could carry only modest loads at the high altitudes, so moving significant quantities of silver required hundreds or thousands of animals. From Arica, the silver was loaded onto ships for transport along the Pacific coast to Callao, the port serving Lima. This coastal voyage was relatively short but not without risks from storms and from English, Dutch or French privateers who prowled the Pacific hoping to capture Spanish treasure. The Spanish developed convoy systems where multiple ships traveled together for mutual protection. At Callao, the silver was unloaded and transported to Lima, where royal officials conducted inspections, collected taxes that hadn't been paid at Potosí, and organized the next stage of transport. Lima became the administrative and economic center for Spanish South America, largely because of its role in managing silver flows. The city's wealth, architecture, and political importance all derived from silver passing through on its way to Spain. The transshipment of silver from the Pacific to the Atlantic required crossing the Isthmus of Panama, one of the most challenging parts of the entire journey. The silver was loaded onto ships in Callao for transport to Panama City on the Pacific side of the isthmus. From Panama City, the silver was carried by mule train across the isthmus to the Caribbean port of Portobello, or later, to Veracruz. This overland journey through dense tropical forest in extreme heat and humidity was arduous and dangerous. Mexican silver from the mines of Zacatecas and Guanajuato followed a different route. It was transported by mule train from the mining centers to Mexico City, where it was taxed and recorded. From Mexico City, it continued to Veracruz on the Gulf of Mexico. Mexican silver production eventually exceeded Peruvian production, making Veracruz as important as the Panama route for silver shipments to Spain. At the Caribbean ports, the silver was loaded onto heavily armed galleons for the Atlantic crossing to Spain. The Spanish developed the fleet system, the flota, where treasure galleons traveled in convoy with warships providing protection. The fleets departed on schedules coordinated with favorable weather and assembled at Havana before crossing the Atlantic. This system provided security, but made the treasure fleets predictable targets that rivals attempted to intercept. The Atlantic crossing was the most dangerous part of the journey. Storms could scatter or sink ships. Pirates and privateers from England, France, and the Netherlands attacked Spanish shipping whenever opportunity arose. The Spanish treasure fleets became legendary targets, with European powers commissioning privateers specifically to hunt them. Despite these dangers, most silver reached Spain safely because the convoy system and the ship's heavy armament deterred most attacks. The arrival of the silver fleet at Seville, and later at Cadiz, was a major event in Spanish economic life. Merchants, creditors, and government officials all awaited the arrival to receive their shares of the silver. The Spanish crown's portion went to the treasury, though often it was already committed to creditors who had loaned money against expected silver revenues. Private silver belonged to merchants who had invested in mining or trade. The distribution of silver from Spain throughout Europe occurred through multiple channels. The Spanish crown used silver to pay for military operations in the Netherlands, Italy, and elsewhere. Spanish merchants used silver to purchase goods from other European countries, and Spanish creditors who held royal debts received silver payments that they then circulated through European banking networks. A significant portion of Spanish silver never actually reached Spain. The Manila galleon trade sent silver directly from Acapulco, Mexico to Manila in the Philippines, where it was exchanged for Asian goods including silk, porcelain, and spices. This trans-Pacific trade was enormously profitable and created direct economic links between the Americas and Asia. Chinese merchants particularly valued Spanish silver, accepting it as payment for goods that European merchants eagerly purchased. The flow of silver to China was so large that Spanish silver became the de facto currency for much of Asian trade. Chinese merchants would accept nothing but silver for many transactions. The demand for silver in China helped drive silver production in the Americas and created global price relationships where silver's value varied based on geographic location. Silver was worth more in China than in Europe, creating profit opportunities for merchants who transported it. The total quantity of silver transported from the Americas to Spain and throughout the world was staggering. Between 1545 and 1800, Approximately 150,000 tons of silver crossed the Atlantic. Thousands of additional tons went to Asia via the Manila Galleon. This represented roughly 85% of global silver production during this period. The scale of this transfer had no historical precedent and wouldn't be matched until the gold rushes of the 19th century. The proportion of this silver that actually benefited the Spanish economy versus the proportion that simply passed through Spain to other destinations revealed the economic weakness underlying Spain's apparent wealth. Much of the silver arriving in Spain immediately left to pay foreign creditors, to purchase foreign goods, or to fund military operations abroad. Spain became a conduit for silver rather than a destination, with wealth flowing through Spanish ports without generating sustainable domestic economic development. Economic paradox. The Spanish Silver Empire created one of history's great economic paradoxes, how the nation controlling unprecedented precious metal wealth became progressively poorer, while its rivals grew richer. Understanding this paradox requires examining the relationship between resource abundance and economic development, a relationship that economists later termed the resource curse. The initial economic impact of American silver on Spain was dramatically positive. The sudden access to vast precious metal wealth allowed the Spanish crown to expand its military forces, fund ambitious construction projects, and pursue aggressive foreign policies. Spain became Europe's dominant power in the 16th century, fielding armies throughout the continent and maintaining a vast empire spanning the Americas, parts of Italy, the Netherlands, and territories elsewhere. The Spanish court became legendary for its opulence and extravagance. Philip II, who ruled from 1556 to 1598 during the peak of silver production, constructed the massive El Escorial Palace monastery complex, financed extensive wars against the Ottoman Empire and Protestant powers, and maintained a bureaucracy and court of enormous expense. The silver revenue made all of this seem affordable, encouraging spending that far exceeded what sustainable taxation of Spain's economy could support. But this silver wealth created powerful economic distortions. The massive influx of precious metals caused significant inflation, as the money supply increased faster than the production of goods and services. This inflation was observed and documented by contemporary Spanish intellectuals, though they didn't fully understand the economic mechanisms at work. Prices in Spain rose faster than in other European countries, making Spanish goods expensive and foreign goods relatively cheap. The price inflation particularly affected Spanish manufactured goods and agricultural products. Spanish artisans and farmers couldn't compete with imports from countries where prices were lower. Rather than stimulating Spanish industry and agriculture, the silver wealth made it more economical to import goods from abroad. Spanish silver was used to purchase French cloth, Dutch ships, Italian luxury goods, and English wool, transferring wealth out of Spain while undermining domestic production. The Spanish crown's fiscal policy exacerbated these problems. Rather than using silver revenue to invest in productive economic development or to build sustainable tax systems, the crown spent silver as quickly as it arrived on military campaigns, debt service, and current consumption. The crown also borrowed extensively against future silver revenues, mortgaging expected income years in advance to foreign bankers who charged high interest rates. The bankruptcy declarations by Spanish monarchs revealed the depth of fiscal dysfunction. Despite controlling the world's largest source of precious metals, the Spanish crown declared bankruptcy in 1557, 1560, 1575, 1596, 1607, 1627, 1647, and 1680. Each bankruptcy represented a failure to pay creditors, followed by renegotiation of debts and resumption of borrowing. The cycle repeated because the fundamental problem, expenditures exceeding revenues, was never addressed. The Spanish economy's failure to develop strong manufacturing and commercial sectors meant that Spain became dependent on other European nations for goods and services. The Netherlands, England, and France developed industries that produced goods Spanish silver purchased. They built merchant fleets that transported goods Spain needed, and their banks provided credit that Spanish chronic deficits required. Spanish silver enriched Spain's rivals while Spain itself remained economically underdeveloped. The social and political consequences of silver dependence were profound. The Spanish nobility and elite focused on capturing shares of silver revenue rather than on productive economic activity. Status came from royal grants, mining concessions, or positions in colonial administration that provided access to silver flows. Entrepreneurship and commerce were viewed as inferior to these direct connections to silver wealth. The tax system reflected and reinforced this orientation toward extracting value from colonial silver rather than developing domestic economic capacity. The Spanish crown taxed colonial silver production heavily, but maintained relatively light taxation of Spanish domestic economic activity. This meant that royal revenues depended on continued high silver production in the Americas, while the Spanish economy remained undertaxed and underdeveloped. The comparison with the Netherlands and England, Spain's rivals who lacked American silver mines, was telling. These countries developed strong commercial sectors, built powerful navies, and created financial systems that mobilized capital efficiently. They became wealthier through trade and manufacturing than Spain became through silver mining. By the 17th century, Dutch and English merchants were financing much of European trade, including substantial portions of Spain's own colonial trade. The theoretical understanding of these economic dynamics developed slowly. Spanish intellectuals in the school of Salamanca, including Martín de Azpilcueta, observed and wrote about the relationship between silver imports and inflation. They recognized that increasing the money supply without corresponding increases in goods caused prices to rise. But this intellectual understanding didn't translate into policy changes that might have addressed the underlying problems. The regional variation within Spain showed that the economic problems weren't inevitable consequences of geography or culture. Regions like Catalonia, that weren't heavily dependent on colonial silver and that developed manufacturing and commerce, were more prosperous than Castile, which received the bulk of colonial revenues. This suggested that the economic pathologies were created by silver dependence rather than by inherent Spanish characteristics. The long-term economic consequences for Spain were severe and lasting. Spain entered the 18th century as a declining power, economically backward compared to northwestern Europe. The Spanish economy lacked the industrial base, commercial networks, and financial institutions that characterized the emerging economic leaders. Spanish silver had enriched other nations while leaving Spain itself relatively poor. The lessons from Spain's experience with silver wealth informed later economic thinking about natural resource management. Economists studying the resource curse or Dutch disease phenomena, where natural resource abundance correlates with slower economic growth, pointed to Spanish silver as a classic historical example. The Spanish case demonstrated that natural resource wealth doesn't automatically create prosperity and can actually hinder economic development if it's not managed carefully. Global transformation. The silver flowing from Spanish-American mines transformed the global economy in the 16th and 17th centuries, creating the first truly worldwide economic system and fundamentally altering trade patterns, price relationships, and economic development across continents. Understanding these global transformations reveals how a resource extracted in the Andes affected economic life from Europe to China. The most fundamental transformation was the creation of a global currency based on Spanish silver. The Spanish silver real and its various denominations became accepted as payment throughout Europe, the Americas, and Asia. Merchants in Amsterdam, Beijing, and Lima all recognized Spanish silver coins and accepted them for transactions. This common currency facilitated trade on a scale previously impossible. The standardization of Spanish silver coinage contributed to its universal acceptance. Spanish mints produced coins with consistent silver content, and the coins were marked to indicate their fineness. The famous piece of 8, the 8 real coin, became the standard large denomination coin for international trade. The coin's design, featuring the Pillars of Hercules and the Spanish coat of arms, became recognized worldwide. The price revolution in Europe was directly connected to American silver imports. As silver flowed into European markets, the money supply increased dramatically. Between 1500 and 1650, European price levels roughly tripled or quadrupled, an unprecedented inflation for pre-modern economies. This price revolution had enormous social and economic consequences, redistributing wealth from creditors to debtors and from those on fixed incomes to those whose incomes rose with prices. The impact on wage earners was particularly significant. Real wages adjusted for purchasing power, declined in many European countries during the 16th and early 17th centuries as prices rose faster than nominal wages. This decline in living standards for workers contributed to social tensions and was part of the context for religious conflicts, peasant uprisings, and political instability that characterized the period. The Asian trade connection created through Spanish silver was transformative for global commerce. Chinese demand for silver was enormous because China's economy operated on a silver standard, but China produced relatively little silver domestically. Spanish-American silver filled this demand, flowing to China through both trans-Pacific Manila galleon trade and through European merchants trading via the Indian Ocean. The quantities of silver going to China were extraordinary. Modern estimates suggest that somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of all American silver production ultimately ended up in China. This massive transfer of wealth from the Americas to Asia via European and Spanish intermediaries created trade patterns that persisted for centuries. The silver trade was the foundation of what would later be called the China trade. The goods purchased with Spanish silver in Asia transformed European consumption patterns and economies. Chinese silk, porcelain and tea became available in European markets in quantities previously unimaginable. Indian textiles including calicos and muslins entered European trade. Southeast Asian spices that had been extremely expensive became more accessible. These Asian goods were paid for largely with American silver. The trans-Pacific trade through the Manila Galleon was one of history's most profitable and longest-lasting trade routes. From 1565 to 1815, Spanish galleons sailed annually from Acapulco, Mexico to Manila, carrying silver and Mexican goods. They returned with Chinese silk, porcelain, and other Asian products that were either consumed in the Americas or transshipped to Spain. Single galleon cargoes could be worth hundreds of thousands or millions of pesos. The development of Atlantic trade systems was equally important. Spanish silver purchases from other European nations stimulated their economies and encouraged specialization. The Dutch focused on shipping and trade. The English developed textile manufacturing. The French produced luxury goods. Each of these economies found niches serving Spanish demand, with silver facilitating the transactions. The African slave trade was financed partly by Spanish silver. The labor-intensive plantation economies developing in Brazil, the Caribbean, and parts of Spanish America required massive labor forces that were supplied through the Atlantic slave trade. Spanish silver was used to purchase enslaved Africans who were transported to the Americas. This created a horrific triangle trade where American silver bought African slaves who produced American plantation goods sold in Europe. The financial innovation stimulated by the need to move and manage large quantities of silver contributed to the development of modern banking and finance. Bills of exchange, financial instruments that allowed merchants to transfer value without physically moving silver, became more sophisticated. Banks in Amsterdam, London, and other commercial centers developed clearing systems that reduced the need to physically transport silver for every transaction. The insurance industry developed partly in response to the risks of transporting valuable silver cargoes. Marine insurance became more sophisticated, with specialized underwriters assessing risks and setting premiums for silver shipments. The insurance markets in London and Amsterdam developed the expertise and capital that would later make these cities global financial centers. The geopolitical consequences of silver flows were profound. The nation-states that successfully captured portions of Spanish silver wealth through trade, privateering, or banking grew powerful. England's rise as a global power was funded partly by capturing Spanish silver through legitimate trade and through privateering and piracy. The Dutch Republic financed its independence struggle partly through trade with Spanish colonies and through capturing Spanish treasure ships. The economic integration created by silver flows was unprecedented in human history. For the first time, sustained economic relationships connected Europe, the Americas, Africa, and Asia in continuous trade. Economic developments in one region affected prices and production in distant regions. A silver shortage in Peru could affect silk prices in China. This integration was primitive by modern standards, but represented the beginning of the global economy. Environmental devastation. The environmental costs of Spanish silver mining were catastrophic and permanent, transforming landscapes, contaminating water and soil, and depleting resources in ways that remain visible today. Understanding this environmental destruction reveals a dimension of the Silver Empire that contemporary accounts often ignored or minimized, but that had profound consequences for affected regions. The deforestation around mining centers was total and irreversible. The amalgamation process and ore smelting required enormous quantities of wood for fuel. Trees were cut to build mine timbers that supported underground tunnels. Wood was needed for construction in the rapidly growing mining cities. The result was that forests within dozens of miles of Potosi and other mining centers were completely cleared. The scale of deforestation can be estimated from production records. Processing 1 ton of silver required burning several tons of wood. With Potosi producing 200–300 tons of silver annually during peak periods, this meant tens of thousands of tons of wood consumed each year just for silver processing. Over decades and centuries, the cumulative consumption of timber was measured in millions of tons. The ecological consequences of this deforestation were severe and cascading. Without tree cover, soil erosion accelerated. The high Andes around Potosi had limited vegetation to begin with, and removing what trees existed exposed soil to erosion from wind and occasional rains. Topsoil washed or blew away, leaving degraded landscapes unable to support even the sparse vegetation that had existed before. The watershed impacts affected regions far from the mining centers. Rivers that previously had clear water became sediment-laden from erosion in deforested areas. The sediment affected aquatic ecosystems and made water less suitable for irrigation and consumption. During floods, the water carried more debris and caused more damage because vegetation that would have slowed runoff was gone. The mercury contamination was perhaps the most serious long-term environmental legacy. The amalgamation process used vast quantities of mercury, much of which was lost into the environment. Workers handling mercury spilled it. The washing of amalgams released mercury into water systems. The heating of amalgams to recover silver released mercury vapor into the atmosphere, and the tailings from processing contained mercury that leached into soil and water. The quantities of mercury released were staggering. Potosi's silver production over 255 years required processing approximately 45,000 tons of silver, with 1 kilogram of mercury needed per kilogram of silver, and perhaps half the mercury being lost. This means roughly 22,500 tons of mercury were released into the environment from Potosi alone. Other mining centers added thousands of additional tons. Mercury persists in the environment indefinitely. It doesn't break down or disappear, but cycles through ecosystems, accumulating in organisms and biomagnifying up food chains. The mercury released during colonial silver mining remains in the environment today, centuries later. Studies of sediments in lakes and rivers near historical mining sites show elevated mercury levels that trace to colonial mining operations. The health effects of this environmental mercury contamination affected populations well beyond the mine workers who had direct exposure. Communities downstream from mining centers consumed fish and other foods containing mercury. They drank water contaminated with mercury. Pregnant women exposed to environmental mercury bore children with neurological damage. These health effects persisted across generations. The physical transformation of the landscape from mining itself was dramatic. Cerro Rico at Potosí was literally hollowed out, honeycombed with tunnels and shafts extending hundreds of feet below the surface. The mountain became structurally unstable from this excavation, with periodic collapses of tunnels and surface areas. Today, the mountain is considered dangerously unstable and further mining is restricted in some areas due to collapse risks. The waste rock and tailings from ore processing created enormous piles of contaminated material that remain around historical mining sites. These tailings contain mercury, arsenic, lead, and other toxic elements that were present in the ore but not extracted during processing. Rain and wind erode these tailings, carrying toxic materials into surrounding environments where they contaminate soil and water. The air pollution from smelting operations affected areas around mining centers. Burning ore releases various toxic gases including sulfur dioxide, arsenic compounds, and heavy metals. Workers and nearby residents breathed these pollutants. The health effects included respiratory diseases and heavy metal poisoning. The pollution was severe enough that contemporary observers commented on the unhealthy air around smelting operations. The water diversions and hydraulic systems built to supply mining operations disrupted natural water flows. Rivers were dammed, redirected and depleted to provide water for ore processing mills. Communities downstream from mining centers found their water supplies reduced or contaminated. Agricultural areas that had relied on river water for irrigation suffered from reduced water availability. The introduction of European livestock and agricultural practices in mining regions created additional environmental pressures. Sheep and cattle grazed areas that previously had supported only native camelids like llamas and alpacas. The introduced animals had different grazing patterns that contributed to erosion and vegetation changes. European farming techniques often weren't well suited to high-altitude Andean conditions and contributed to soil degradation. The long-term ecosystem changes were profound and largely irreversible. The high Andes around Potosi today are barren landscapes with minimal vegetation, heavily eroded soils, and degraded water systems. While some of this reflects the naturally harsh environment at high altitude, much of the degradation is directly attributable to colonial mining. Restoration would take centuries even if actively pursued, and most damaged areas receive no restoration efforts. The contemporary awareness of these environmental costs was limited. Spanish colonial authorities and mine owners focused on maximizing production and profits. Environmental damage was viewed as an acceptable cost of extracting wealth. Indigenous communities who suffered most directly from environmental destruction had no power to prevent it or demand remediation. Empire collapse. The decline and eventual collapse of Spain's Silver Empire occurred gradually over the 17th and 18th centuries, driven by falling production, increasing costs, military defeats, and the fundamental economic weaknesses that silver dependence had created. Understanding this collapse reveals how resource-based power proved unsustainable without broader economic development. Silver production at Potosi peaked in the 1590s at approximately 250–300 tons annually, and then began a long decline. By 1650, production had fallen to perhaps 150 tons. By 1700, it was below 100 tons. By 1800, Potosi produced only a fraction of its peak output. This production decline had multiple causes that reinforced each other in a downward spiral. The depletion of high-grade ores was the most fundamental cause. After 150 years of intensive mining, the richest and most accessible ores had been extracted. Remaining ores were deeper, lower grade, and more expensive to mine and process. The simple economics of mining dictated that as costs rose and ore quality declined, production became less profitable and eventually uneconomical at some mines. The flooding of deep mines created enormous technical challenges. As mines extended hundreds of feet below the surface, they encountered water that seeped into the workings. Pumping this water required expensive machinery and continuous effort. Some mines became too flooded to operate economically. The technology for deep mine drainage wasn't adequate to keep the deepest mines operational. The labor supply became increasingly problematic. The indigenous population had been devastated by disease, overwork, and the general disruption of conquest. The communities subject to meter service had been depopulated to the point where they couldn't provide the required workers. The Spanish had to expand the meter's geographic scope and increase the proportion of workers required, making the system more brutal but also less sustainable. The mercury supply from Huancavelica became unreliable. The Huancavelica mine suffered from similar problems as Potosi: depletion of high-grade ores, flooding, and labor shortages. Mercury production declined, and what was produced became more expensive. Some periods saw mercury shortages that constrained silver production. The Spanish tried importing mercury from Spain, but the cost made silver production less profitable. The Spanish crown's fiscal crisis intensified as silver revenues declined.
The crown had committed to expenditures and debt service based on expected silver revenues that were no longer materializing. As income fell, the crown increased tax rates on what silver was produced and extracted more revenue from other colonial sources. These tax increases further discouraged mining investment and accelerated production decline. The military defeat Spain suffered weakened its ability to maintain colonial control and to protect silver shipments. The defeat of the Spanish Armada by England in 1588 marked the beginning of Spain's naval decline. Dutch independence following the 80 Years' War meant Spain lost control of the economically vital Netherlands. French military victories in the 30 Years' War and later conflicts reduced Spanish power in Europe.
The loss of Spain's European territories eliminated important revenue sources and strategic positions. The Spanish Netherlands, Milan, Naples, and other possessions that had provided revenue and military bases were lost or became liabilities requiring defense. Spain's empire contracted, but the costs of maintaining what remained didn't decline proportionally. The rise of competing silver sources reduced Spanish market dominance. Mexican mines, particularly Guanajuato, became increasingly important and eventually produced more silver than Potosi. But even total Spanish-American production faced new competition. The Japanese discovered silver deposits and became major producers in the 17th century. These alternative sources reduced the strategic value of Spanish mines. The development of alternative payment systems reduced dependence on physical silver for international trade.
The financial innovations of Dutch and English banks, including more sophisticated bills of exchange and credit instruments, meant that international trade could be conducted with less physical transfer of precious metals. This reduced demand for Spanish silver, even as supply was declining. The Bourbon reforms of the 18th century attempted to reverse Spanish decline by modernizing colonial administration and economic policy. The Bourbons replaced the Habsburg dynasty in 1700 and brought new ideas about governance and economy. They reformed tax collection, reduced corruption, and attempted to stimulate colonial production. These reforms had some success in the 18th century, but they couldn't overcome the fundamental problems.
The independence movements in Spanish America in the early 19th century ended Spanish control of the silver mines, starting with the Napoleonic invasion of Spain in 1808 and continuing through the 1820s. Spanish-American colonies fought for and achieved independence. The new republics controlled the mines that had funded Spanish power for 3 centuries. Silver production continued, but the revenue went to Latin American treasuries rather than to Spain. The legacy of silver dependence was evident in Spain's 19th century economic backwardness. Spain remained agricultural and economically underdeveloped compared to northwestern Europe. The Industrial Revolution that transformed Britain, Belgium, Germany, and France largely bypassed Spain. Spanish per capita income and living standards lagged behind the European leaders. This economic weakness had roots in the economic distortions created during centuries of silver dependence.
The regional variation within former Spanish America in economic development partly reflected the legacy of colonial silver mining. Regions like Potosi that had been centers of colonial silver production were often economically depressed in the independence period. The environmental devastation, the demographic collapse, and the economic structures oriented toward extraction rather than sustainable development all contributed to persistent poverty. The historical memory of the Silver Empire in Spain and Latin America differed significantly. In Spain, the Silver Empire became associated with lost glory and with a golden age when Spain was Europe's dominant power. Nostalgia for this period ignored the economic dysfunctions and the human costs. In Latin America, the Silver Empire was remembered as a period of brutal exploitation that extracted wealth while destroying indigenous societies and environments.
The archaeological and historical remains of the Silver Empire are substantial. Potosi itself remains a city of approximately 200,000 people. Its colonial architecture and the scarred mountain above it testaments to the Silver era. Mine tunnels riddle the mountain, and mercury contamination persists in the environment. Similar remains exist at Zacatecas, Guanajuato, and other mining centers, physical evidence of the system that transformed the early modern world. The decline and eventual collapse of Spain's Silver Empire occurred gradually over the 17th and 18th centuries, driven by falling production, increasing costs, military defeats, and the fundamental economic weaknesses that silver dependence had created. Understanding this collapse reveals how resource-based power proved unsustainable without broader economic development, and how the very wealth that had elevated Spain to global dominance became the mechanism of its undoing. Silver production at Potosi peaked in the 1590s at approximately 250–300 tons annually, and then began a long decline that would continue for 2 centuries. By 1650, production had fallen to perhaps 150 tons. By 1700, it was below 100 tons. By 1800, Potosi produced only a fraction of its peak output, and the once great mining city had shrunk from its height of perhaps 200,000 inhabitants to fewer than 20,000. This production decline had multiple causes that reinforced each other in a downward spiral from which the Spanish colonial system could never recover. The depletion of high-grade ores was the most fundamental cause of declining production. After 150 years of intensive mining, the richest and most accessible ores had been extracted. The surface deposits that had made Potosi's early fortunes were long gone. The high-grade ores at moderate depths had been excavated. What remained were ores deeper in the mountain, lower in silver content, and more expensive to mine and process.
The simple economics of mining dictated that as costs rose and ore quality declined, production became less profitable and eventually uneconomical at some mines. Miners had to move more rock and process more ore to extract the same amount of silver. The labor requirements increased while the return on that labor decreased.
The technological limitations of pre-industrial mining became increasingly apparent as operations extended deeper. The mines at Potosi eventually reached depths of 500 to 700 feet below the surface. At these depths, ventilation became critical. Workers could suffocate from lack of oxygen or from toxic gases that accumulated in poorly ventilated areas. The Spanish developed some ventilation systems, but they were primitive and often inadequate. The deeper the mines went, the more difficult it became to provide adequate air circulation. The flooding of deep mines created enormous technical challenges that colonial technology struggled to address. As mines extended hundreds of feet below the surface, they inevitably encountered groundwater that seeped into the workings. In shallow mines, this water could be removed by workers carrying buckets to the surface, or by simple drainage adits, horizontal tunnels that allowed water to flow out by gravity.
But as mines deepened below the level where drainage adits were practical, more sophisticated pumping became necessary. The Spanish attempted to address this using animal-powered pumps, and later some water-powered pumping systems, but these were expensive to install and operate. Some of the deepest and potentially most productive mine sections became too flooded to operate economically. The irony was bitter. The mines were being defeated by water in a region where surface water was scarce and precious.
The structural instability of the mountain itself became a growing problem as the accumulated centuries of mining left Cerro Rico honeycombed with tunnels and voids. The mountain's internal structure was progressively weakened as ore was removed. Tunnel collapses became more frequent and more catastrophic. Workers were buried alive when tunnels failed. Surface subsidence created dangerous conditions where the ground could suddenly collapse into voids below. The very success of earlier mining created hazards that made later mining more dangerous and more expensive. Mine owners had to invest more in timbering and support structures to prevent collapses, adding to costs while not increasing production. The labor supply became increasingly problematic as the 17th century progressed. The indigenous population had been devastated by disease, overwork, and the general disruption of conquest and colonization.
The first great epidemic had been smallpox, which swept through the Americas starting in the 1520s, killing millions who had no immunity to European diseases. Subsequent epidemics of measles, typhus, and other diseases continued reducing indigenous populations. In the mining regions, this demographic catastrophe was compounded by the direct mortality from mining itself, and by the disruption of traditional agricultural and social systems that supported population reproduction.
The communities subject to meter service had been particularly hard hit. These communities lost not just those who died during meter service, but also those who fled to escape future service. Families disrupted by the meter had fewer children. Agricultural production declined when communities lost their most productive workers, leading to malnutrition that increased disease susceptibility. The population in the mitre catchment area declined so severely that by the late 17th century, the communities couldn't provide the number of workers the mitre theoretically required. Colonial authorities responded by expanding the mitre's geographic scope to include more distant communities and by increasing the proportion of workers required from each community, making the system even more brutal but also less sustainable. The attempt to substitute African slave labor for declining indigenous labor had only limited success.
The Spanish imported enslaved Africans to work in the mines, particularly in skilled positions and in the amalgamation process where mercury exposure was most severe. But African slaves were expensive to purchase, and the mortality rates in the mines meant that the investment in a slave might be lost within months or a few years. The economics of using slave labor in high-altitude mining were difficult to justify, and while significant numbers of Africans were forced to work in the mines, slave labor never fully replaced the indigenous labor the Mita had provided.
The mercury supply from Huancavelica became unreliable, creating a bottleneck that constrained silver production even when ore and labor were available. The Huancavelica mercury mine suffered from similar problems as Potosi: depletion of high-grade ores, flooding, and labor shortages. Mercury production declined from peaks of 5,000 to 6,000 quintals annually in the early 17th century to perhaps 2,000 quintals by the late 17th century. The quality of ore declined, requiring more effort to produce each unit of mercury. The mines deepened and flooded, just as at Potosi, and the labor situation was equally grim, with indigenous workers dying from mercury exposure at rates that horrified even contemporary observers accustomed to colonial brutality. The health effects of working at Huancavelica were particularly severe because workers were exposed to mercury vapor during the smelting process that liberated mercury from cinnabar ore.
This exposure was more intense than what amalgamation workers experienced. Huancavelica workers developed the trembling disease rapidly, often within months. Many died within a year or two of beginning work. The Spanish colonial authorities recognized that assignment to Huancavelica was essentially a death sentence, yet they continued to force indigenous workers to labor there because the mercury was essential to silver production.
The economic impact of mercury shortages reverberated through the entire silver production system. When mercury supplies were inadequate, silver ore that had been mined and brought to the surface couldn't be processed. It accumulated in piles waiting for mercury that might take months or years to arrive. Some mine owners, desperate to continue operations, purchased mercury on black markets at prices far above the official controlled prices. This further reduced profitability and made marginal mines uneconomical. The Spanish crown attempted to address mercury shortages by importing mercury from Almaden in Spain, but the cost of transporting mercury across the Atlantic and then overland to mining centers made this mercury extremely expensive. The Spanish crown's fiscal crisis intensified as silver revenues declined, creating a vicious cycle where fiscal desperation led to policies that further discouraged production. The crown had committed to expenditures and debt service based on expected silver revenues that were no longer materializing. Military operations throughout Europe, the cost of maintaining the vast Spanish bureaucracy, debt service to foreign and domestic creditors, and the expenses of the royal court all consumed revenues faster than they arrived. As income from silver fell, the crown's deficit grew, forcing it to borrow more at higher interest rates and to search desperately for additional revenue. The crown's response was to increase tax rates on the declining silver production, extracting a larger share of each peso produced even as total production fell. The quinto real, the royal fifth, had theoretically been 20% of production, though actual collection was often lower due to evasion and administrative inefficiency. But as production declined, the Crown increased the official tax rate and improved collection enforcement. By the late 17th century, the effective tax burden on silver production had increased substantially. Mine owners who might have invested in maintaining production or exploring new areas found that higher taxes made these investments unprofitable. The rational response was to reduce investment, which further accelerated production decline. The Spanish crown also extracted more revenue from other colonial sources as silver declined. Tribute requirements from indigenous communities were increased. Taxes on colonial trade were raised. Forced loans and special levies were imposed on colonial merchants and landowners. These additional exactions reduced the colonial economy's prosperity and further discouraged the kind of economic development that might have created alternative revenue sources. The colonies were being milked dry in a desperate attempt to sustain a fiscal system that was fundamentally unsustainable. The military defeats Spain suffered during the 17th century both resulted from and contributed to the empire's decline. The defeat of the Spanish Armada by England in 1588 marked the beginning of Spain's naval decline and the end of Spanish naval supremacy. Spanish control of the seas, which had allowed it to dominate Atlantic trade and maintain communications with its far-flung empire, began to erode. English, Dutch, and French ships challenged Spanish shipping with increasing success. Privateering and piracy against Spanish vessels became endemic, with Spanish treasure fleets facing constant threats. The Dutch revolt and the eventual independence of the Netherlands following the 80 Years' War that ended in 1648 was a catastrophic blow to Spanish power and prestige. The Netherlands had been Spain's richest European possession, a center of commerce and manufacturing that generated substantial revenue.
The loss of the Netherlands eliminated an important revenue source and demonstrated that Spanish military power could be successfully resisted. The new Dutch Republic became one of Spain's most dangerous rivals, using its commercial strength and naval power to challenge Spanish interests globally.
The 30 Years' War, which devastated much of Central Europe from 1618 to 1648, drained Spanish resources and ended with Spain in a weakened position. Spain had intervened in this complex conflict to support Catholic and Habsburg interests, committing vast military resources and enormous sums of money. But the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 marked a defeat for Spanish objectives. Spain had to recognize Dutch independence and accept a weakened position in European politics. The financial cost had been staggering, requiring Spain to borrow enormous sums against declining silver revenues. French military victories in the late 17th and early 18th centuries further reduced Spanish power in Europe. France under Louis XIV emerged as the dominant European power, displacing Spain from its former preeminence. Spanish possessions in Italy and the Netherlands came under French pressure.
The War of Spanish Succession from 1701 to 1714 fought over who would succeed to the Spanish throne after the last Habsburg king died without heirs, ended with a French Bourbon becoming king of Spain, but with Spain having to cede territories including Gibraltar and parts of the Netherlands to its enemies.
The loss of Spain's European territories eliminated important revenue sources and strategic positions that had been integral to Spanish power. The Spanish Netherlands, Milan, Naples, and other possessions that had provided revenue, soldiers, and strategic military bases were lost or became liabilities requiring defense rather than assets contributing to Spanish strength. Spain's empire contracted geographically, but the costs of maintaining what remained didn't decline proportionally. The administrative structure, the military garrisons, and the naval forces required to hold the American colonies and the remaining European possessions continued, consuming revenues even as the total revenue base shrank. The rise of competing silver sources reduced Spanish market dominance and the strategic value of Spanish-American mines. Mexican mines, particularly Guanajuato, became increasingly important in the 18th century and eventually produced more silver than Potosi.
Guanajuato's production grew from modest levels in the early 18th century to exceed 20 million pesos annually by the late 18th century, making it the world's most productive silver mining center. But even this impressive production went to the Spanish crown, not to Spain itself, and much of it was used to finance colonial administration rather than being remitted to Spain.
Japanese silver production, which had been minimal before 1600, expanded dramatically in the early 17th century following the discovery of rich deposits and the adoption of improved mining techniques. Japanese silver flooded Asian markets, competing with Spanish-American silver and reducing prices. Chinese merchants who had previously paid premium prices for Spanish silver found they could obtain silver from Japanese sources at lower cost. This competition reduced the profitability of the Trans-Pacific Manila galleon trade and diminished one of the advantages Spanish silver had enjoyed. The development of alternative payment systems and financial instruments reduced dependence on physical silver for international trade, undermining another of the advantages that had made Spanish silver central to the global economy.
The financial innovations of Dutch and English banks, including more sophisticated bills of exchange and credit instruments, meant that international trade could be conducted with less physical transfer of precious metals. Merchants could execute large transactions using paper instruments backed by the reputation and capital of major banking houses. This reduced demand for Spanish silver even as supply was declining, creating unfavorable market conditions for Spanish silver producers.
The Bourbon reforms of the 18th century represented the most serious attempt to reverse Spanish decline by modernizing colonial administration and economic policy. The Bourbons replaced the Habsburg dynasty in 1700, and the new dynasty brought different ideas about governance and economy, influenced by Enlightenment thinking and by the examples of more successful European states like France and Britain. The Bourbon kings and their ministers recognized that Spain had fallen behind and that fundamental reforms were necessary. The administrative reforms aimed to reduce corruption, improve tax collection, and make colonial governance more efficient and responsive to Madrid's control. The Bourbons created new administrative units, appointed professional administrators rather than relying on traditional elites, and attempted to break the power of entrenched colonial interests that had captured much of the colonial economy for private benefit.
The reforms had some success in increasing royal revenues and improving administrative efficiency, but they also created tensions with colonial elites whose privileges and profits were threatened.
The economic reforms attempted to stimulate colonial production and trade while ensuring that more of the benefits accrued to the Spanish crown rather than to colonial merchants, foreign traders, or smugglers. The Bourbons relaxed some trade restrictions, allowing more legal commerce between colonies, and they attempted to suppress smuggling, which had become endemic and which deprived the crown of customs revenues. They encouraged mining through tax incentives and technical assistance, providing mercury at subsidized prices to stimulate silver production. These reforms had some success in the 18th century. Silver production increased from its late 17th century lows, though it never recovered to the peak levels of the 1590s. The colonial economies grew, with new agricultural and manufacturing activities developing alongside the traditional focus on mining.
Royal revenues increased, allowing Spain to maintain its empire longer than might otherwise have been possible, but the reforms couldn't overcome the fundamental problems accumulated over 2 centuries of economic distortion and administrative dysfunction.
The independence movements in Spanish America in the early 19th century ended Spanish control of the silver mines that had funded Spanish power for 3 centuries. The trigger was Napoleon's invasion of Spain in 1808, which created a political crisis when the legitimate king was overthrown and a French-controlled government attempted to rule Spain. The Spanish-American colonies refused to recognize the French-imposed government, creating a situation where colonial authorities had to decide whether they still owed allegiance to Spain, and if so, to which faction claiming to represent Spain. The political uncertainty catalyzed independence movements that had been developing for decades. Colonial elites, influenced by Enlightenment ideas and by the examples of American and French revolutions, began questioning Spanish rule. The rigid social hierarchies that privileged Spanish-born officials over American-born colonists created resentments.
The economic restrictions that required colonial trade to flow through Spanish ports and Spanish merchants created commercial grievances. And the general decline of Spanish power made independence seem achievable rather than quixotic.
The independence wars that followed were long, bloody, and destructive. Fighting began in 1810 in Mexico and spread throughout Spanish America. The conflicts were not simple wars of colonies against the mother country, but complex civil wars where Spanish loyalists, independence advocates, and various regional and factional interests fought for control. The fighting disrupted economies, destroyed infrastructure, and killed hundreds of thousands. Mining production collapsed during the wars as mines were abandoned, flooded, or damaged, and as the labor and capital necessary for operations fled or were diverted to military purposes. By the mid-1820s, most of Spanish America had achieved independence. Spain retained only Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. The new republics controlled the mines that had funded Spanish power for 3 centuries.
Silver production eventually recovered and grew in some regions, particularly in Mexico, but the revenue went to Latin American treasuries rather than to Spain. The economic connection that had linked Spain to American silver for nearly 300 years was severed, removing the foundation of whatever remained of Spanish prosperity and power.
The legacy of silver dependence was evident in Spain's 19th century economic backwardness and political instability. Spain remained primarily agricultural and economically underdeveloped compared to northwestern Europe. The Industrial Revolution that transformed Britain, Belgium, Germany, and France largely bypassed Spain. Spanish manufacturing was limited and technologically backward. Spanish railways, telegraph systems, and other modern infrastructure developed slowly and with foreign capital and expertise. Spanish per capita income and living standards lagged behind the European leaders by margins that widened as the 19th century progressed. This economic weakness had clear roots in the economic distortions created during centuries of silver dependence. Spain had never developed the industrial base, the commercial networks, the banking systems, or the technical expertise that characterized successful industrial economies.
The focus on extracting and spending colonial revenues rather than on developing domestic productive capacity had left Spain without the foundation for modern economic growth. When the colonial revenues disappeared, Spain had no alternative basis for prosperity. The nation that had once been Europe's richest found itself among Europe's poorest.
The political consequences of economic weakness included chronic instability, military interventions, and eventually civil war. Spain experienced numerous military pronunciamientos, military coups or revolts throughout the 19th century as factions fought for control of a weak state. Carlists' wars fought over succession, and the role of traditional versus liberal institutions disrupted the country repeatedly. The inability to develop stable political institutions or to address profound social and economic problems eventually contributed to the Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 1939, one of the 20th century's most destructive conflicts. The regional variation within former Spanish America in economic development partly reflected the legacy of colonial silver mining and the broader colonial economy. Regions like Potosi, that had been centers of colonial silver production, were often economically depressed in the independence period and remained poor into the modern era.
The environmental devastation, the demographic collapse, and the economic structures oriented toward extraction rather than sustainable development all contributed to persistent poverty. Potosi today is one of the poorest regions in Bolivia, a country that itself is among South America's poorest despite, or perhaps partly because of, the silver wealth extracted from its territory during the colonial period.
Regions that had developed more diversified economies during the colonial period, or that had been relatively marginal to the colonial system and thus less thoroughly exploited, sometimes fared better after independence. Areas that had focused on agriculture for regional markets, that had developed some manufacturing, or that had maintained stronger indigenous communities and institutions often had better foundations for post-independence development than regions dominated by extractive mining that had destroyed local societies and environments while enriching distant metropoles. The comparison between former Spanish colonies and former British colonies in the Americas revealed some of the costs of the different colonial systems. The British North American colonies that became the United States had never had the silver resources that Spanish colonies possessed, but they developed more diversified economies, more inclusive political institutions, and more equitable social structures.
These advantages, created during the colonial period, contributed to more successful development after independence. The question of how much of Latin America's development challenges trace to colonial legacies versus post-independence policies remains debated, but the colonial silver economy clearly shaped institutions and development patterns in ways that persisted for centuries.
The historical memory of the Silver Empire in Spain and Latin America differed significantly and reflected the different experiences and perspectives of colonizers and colonized. In Spain, the Silver Empire became associated with lost glory and with a golden age when Spain was Europe's dominant power. The 16th and early 17th centuries were remembered as Spain's Siglo de Oro, golden century, when Spanish arts, literature, and culture flourished, funded by American silver. This nostalgia for imperial greatness ignored or minimized the economic dysfunctions that had made the glory unsustainable and the human costs paid by those subjected to Spanish colonial rule. In Latin America, the Silver Empire was remembered as a period of brutal exploitation that extracted enormous wealth while destroying indigenous societies and environments. The mita became a symbol of colonial oppression.
The demographic catastrophe of conquest and colonization was attributed partly to the demands of the mining economy. The persistent poverty of mining regions was seen as the legacy of extraction that took everything while leaving nothing. This memory shaped Latin American identity and politics, contributing to suspicion of foreign investment and to support for economic nationalism and resource sovereignty.
The archaeological and historical remains of the Silver Empire are substantial and provide physical evidence of the system's scale and impact. Potosi itself remains a city of approximately 200,000 people, its colonial architecture and the scarred mountain above it testaments to the Silver Era. The historic center was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in recognition of its historical importance, though it was also placed on the endangered list due to deterioration and to continued mining that threatens the structural integrity of the mountain and the colonial buildings. Mine tunnels riddle Cerro Rico, estimated at perhaps 5,000 separate shafts and countless kilometers of passages, most now abandoned and dangerous. Mercury contamination persists in soil and water, measurable centuries after the colonial period ended. Similar remains exist at Zacatecas, Guanajuato, and other mining centers scattered across Mexico, Bolivia, Peru, and other countries.
Colonial churches built with silver revenues still dominate town squares. Colonial mansions that once housed wealthy mine owners stand as monuments to the concentrated wealth that mining created. And the environmental scars, deforested mountains, mercury-contaminated streams, collapsed mine workings, provide evidence of the destruction that accompanied the wealth. These physical remains keep the memory of the Silver Empire present in ways that documents and histories alone could not.
The Spanish Silver Empire that dominated global economics from 1545 to 1800 represents one of history's most significant resource exploitation systems, generating wealth on a scale unprecedented before industrialization, while creating human suffering and environmental destruction that persisted across centuries. The approximately 150,000 tons of silver extracted from Spanish-American mines, roughly 85% of global production during this period, transformed the world economy, funded the Spanish Empire's rise and decline, and left lasting consequences visible today. The human cost was extraordinary. An estimated 8 million indigenous and African workers died in the mines and processing facilities, victims of accidents, overwork, altitude sickness, and mercury poisoning. The MITA forced labor system compelled millions more to serve in conditions that destroyed their health and devastated their communities.
The demographic collapse of indigenous populations in mining regions was more severe than in areas not subjected to forced mining labor, providing clear evidence of the system's deadly impact.
The economic paradox, Spain's bankruptcy despite controlling unprecedented silver wealth, demonstrates that natural resource abundance doesn't automatically create prosperity. The silver influx caused inflation, discouraged domestic industry, and created dependency on imports that enriched Spain's rivals while leaving Spain itself economically underdeveloped. The Spanish case became a textbook example for economists studying the resource curse. The environmental legacy remains visible and measurable centuries later. The deforested landscapes around Potosi, the mercury contamination in soil and water systems, and the physically altered mountains hollowed by mining all testify to the scale of environmental destruction. Mercury released during colonial silver processing continues cycling through ecosystems, causing health effects that span generations. The global transformation driven by Spanish silver was profound and permanent. The creation of the first worldwide currency, the integration of trade systems connecting Europe, the Americas, Africa, and Asia, and the price revolution in Europe all stemmed from American silver production. These changes laid groundwork for the global economy that would develop more fully during industrialization. The technological innovations, including the mercury amalgamation process, represented significant advances in metallurgy and industrial organization. The systems developed for managing large-scale mining operations, for moving precious metals across oceans, and for financing complex international trade, all contributed to commercial and financial development. The moral reckoning with this history remains incomplete. Spain has not formally acknowledged or apologized for the forced labor systems and deaths caused by colonial silver mining. The wealth extracted from the Americas enriched Spanish and European elites while the regions where silver was mined remained poor. The descendants of those who died in the mines have received no compensation or recognition. Whether the Silver Empire's benefits, including technological advances, global economic integration, and the cultural achievements funded by silver wealth, justify its costs is ultimately a subjective judgment that balances enormous human suffering against historical progress. But the historical evidence suggests that the costs fell disproportionately on indigenous and African workers while the benefits accrued primarily to European elites. The question of whether alternative development paths might have achieved economic progress without such catastrophic human and environmental costs is unanswerable but worth contemplating. The Spanish-American colonies had resources and populations that could have supported different economic models, but the political economy of colonial extraction prioritized rapid wealth transfer to Spain over sustainable local development. The lasting impact on Latin American development patterns is significant. Regions oriented toward resource extraction for export, rather than diversified economic development during the colonial period, often struggled with economic development after independence. The legacy of the Silver Empire includes not just environmental and demographic damage, but also economic structures and political cultures that persisted across centuries.